Late at night, when the world finally became quiet, the question returned. He was alone in his room, lights dim, phone face down on the table. Outside the window, the city glowed softly, as if it were breathing. Cars moved like slow streams of light. Everything looked normal, solid, real. But he did not feel solid. He sat still and watched his own reflection in the dark glass. The face looked familiar, yet distant, like someone he used to know. He knew his name, he knew his age, he knew his memories. Still, something felt missing. The question rose again, calm but heavy. Who am I? Really? Not the version on paper. Not the story told to others. Not the roles, the habits, the past mistakes. Something deeper. Something underneath all of that. Earlier that day, he had read a line in a science article. It seemed harmless at first, almost poetic. At the deepest level, reality does not exist until it is observed. He tried to ignore it, but the sentence stayed with him. It followed him through the day. Now, in the quiet, it grew louder. If reality waits to be observed, then what is it doing before that? And more importantly, what is he? He remembered what physics said about matter. That atoms are mostly empty space. That particles are not really particles at all. They are waves of possibility. They exist in many states at once, until something until something observes. He looked down at his hands. They felt solid. They felt real. But science said that feeling was an illusion created by forces in motion. No solid core. No tiny, hard center. Just energy, vibration, and probability. If his body was not truly solid, then what was it? A pattern, maybe. A temporary arrangement of something deeper. The thought made his chest feel tight. He remembered learning that the atoms in his body were ancient, forged inside stars that died billions of years ago, long before Earth, long before humans. That meant he was not separate from the universe. It was the universe. Rearranged. The room felt different now. Largely a stranger. If his body was energy, and his thoughts were electrical signals, and his memories were stored patterns, then where did the I live? Where was the one who felt present right now? It closed his eyes. Thoughts kept appearing. Images, words, emotions. None of them asked permission. They simply arrived. If he did not choose his thoughts, then who was choosing? Another memory surfaced. He had once heard that in certain experiments, particles behaved differently when they were being watched. That the act of observation changed. The result, reality, cared about attention. That idea shook him. What if the observer was not outside reality, but inside it? What if consciousness was not a passive viewer, but an active part of how the universe worked? A quiet fear appeared, not sharp, but deep. If the self was not a fixed thing, but something shaped by observation, then identity was not permanent. It could shift, it could dissolve, it could change. That was frightening and freeing. He realized this question was not abstract or philosophical. It was personal. It touched everything. His choices, his fears, his future. The room had not changed. The world outside continued as usual. Yet something inside him had cracked open. He looked again at his reflection. For the first time, he did not ask what he looked like. He asked who was looking. The question did not demand an answer. It only waited, and somewhere deep inside, the viewer felt it too. The next morning, the man walked through the city as if he were seeing it for the first time. Buildings rose around him, sharp and heavy. Streets felt firm beneath his feet. People passed by, busy and certain of where they were going. Everything looked solid, obvious, reliable, and yet, he could not shake what he had learned. Science said this world was not what it appeared to be. As he walked, he remembered how people once believed the universe was made of small, solid pieces, tiny building blocks that fit together like bricks. Atoms were thought to be the final answer, the deepest layer of reality. But physics had kept digging, and what it found was not solid at all. Inside atoms, there was mostly empty space. Inside that space, particles did not sit still. They moved, flickered, appeared, and disappeared. Sometimes they acted like tiny points, sometimes like waves spread across space, sometimes they were nowhere specific at all. This was the part that disturbed him most. At the deepest level, matter did not have a clear position. It existed as probability, as a range of possible states. Only when measured did it settle into one outcome. Reality, it seemed, waited. He stopped at a crosswalk and watched the signal change. Red to green, orderly, predictable. But beneath that, surface order. The universe was playing a very different game, one where certainty did not exist until interaction, one where the act of observing mattered. He wondered how many people around him knew this, how many understood that the ground they trusted was built on uncertainty. If matter itself was uncertain, then solidity was an illusion created by repetition, by patterns that stayed stable long enough to feel real. That idea followed him like a shadow. Later, he sat in a quiet cafe, holding a warm cup between his hands. He felt the heat. He trusted it. But now, he knew the warmth came from motion, from countless invisible particles, vibrating and colliding. Nothing was still. Nothing was fixed. Even the cup was a process. This realization slowly changed something inside him. If objects were not truly objects, but events, then maybe identity was the same. Not a thing you possess, but something that happens. A pattern that continues for a while, then changes. He thought about his body. Every few years, most of its cells were replaced. New atoms came in, old ones left. Yet he still felt like the same person. How could that be? Perhaps the self was not the material itself, but the pattern holding it together, like a river that remains the same river, even though the water is never the same. The thought felt strange, but also familiar. He remembered moments when he had changed deeply, when old fears disappeared, when new values appeared, when the person he once was no longer felt real, and yet something had remained, or had it. The deeper he went, the more the question returned. If matter is not solid, and the self is made of matter, then what is the self really made of? Physics did not give an easy answer. It only offered a direction. Reality, at its core, was relational. It existed through interaction, through measurement, through connection. Nothing stood alone. Nothing existed by itself. This idea quietly challenged everything he believed about independence, separation, and control. My identity was not locked inside him. Maybe it formed through relationships, with the world, with others, with attention itself. As he finished his drink and stood up, the city no longer felt like a collection of objects. It felt like a living web of events, constantly forming and dissolving. And somewhere inside that web, something was aware, not fixed, not solid. But present. The question did not fade. It grew clearer. If reality becomes real through observation, then the observer may be more important than anything observed. And that thought pointed inward, toward the mind, toward consciousness, toward the one who was asking. The man began to notice something strange about his thoughts. They appeared suddenly, without warning. A memory, a worry, a random image. Each one arrived fully formed, as if from nowhere. He did not invite them. He did not build them piece by piece. They simply showed up. This unsettled him more than anything he had learned about atoms or particles. Thoughts came on their own. Then who was thinking them? He sat quietly one evening and decided to watch his mind the way a scientist watches an experiment. He did nothing. He waited. A thought appeared, then another, then an emotion followed, pulling his attention with it. He realized something important. There was a difference between the thoughts and the one noticing them. The observer was not the thought. It was the one aware of the thought. This idea stayed with him. He read more. He listened more. He discovered that neuroscience had been asking the same question for years. Where is the self in the brain? Scientists had searched for it. They scanned the brain. They measured activity. They tracked signals. But they never found a single place where the I lived. There was no center, no command room, no clear line that said, here is the self. Instead, there were systems, networks, processes working together. Vision here, memory there, emotion somewhere else. The sense of being someone seemed to appear after the fact. Like a story, the brain told itself to stay organized. This idea shook him deeply. If the self was a story, then who was listening to it? He learned something else that felt even more unsettling. In some experiments, scientists found that the brain begins preparing an action before a person becomes aware of choosing it. The decision starts first. The feeling of choice comes later. Did that mean free will was an illusion? Or did it mean the observer was not where people thought it was? He remembered what physics said about observation. That measurement changes outcomes. That attention matters. What if consciousness was doing something similar inside the brain? not controlling every detail, but shaping what became real by what it noticed. He began to see the mind as a stage. Thoughts entered, emotions moved across it, sensations rose and fell, but the stage itself remained, quiet, open, aware. That awareness felt different from everything else. It did not have a shape. It did not argue. It did not rush. He simply noticed. He wondered if this awareness was the same thing people had been pointing to for thousands of years, using different names: mind, spirit, soul, consciousness. Maybe science and philosophy were circling the same mystery from different sides. If matter needed observation to become definite, and the mind needed awareness to become experience, then the observer was not a small detail. It was central. This changed how he looked at himself. He was no longer just a body reacting to the world. He was also the space in which reactions appeared, not separate from the brain, but not limited to any single thought either. The idea felt fragile, like it could disappear if he grabbed it too tightly. Still, something inside him recognized it. Night, as he lay awake, thoughts continued to come and go, but now he did not chase them. He watched, and in that watching, he felt a strange calm. The question that once felt heavy began to shift. Maybe the self was not something to define. Maybe it was something to notice. And if that was true, then identity was not fixed in the past. It was alive in the present moment, waiting, observing. Over the next few days, the man noticed a quiet change. He still went to work. He still spoke to people. He still followed his routines. But something in the way he experienced himself had softened. He no longer felt like a solid object moving through the world. He felt more like something unfolding. One afternoon, he sat in a park and watched the wind move through the trees. The leaves shook and shimmered, yet the tree remained. It looked the same from a distance, but up close, everything was in motion. Nothing stood still. That image stayed with him. He began to wonder if the self was like that tree, not a fixed thing, but a stable pattern made from constant change. Science seemed to agree. He learned that almost every cell in the human body is replaced over time. Skin, blood, even parts of the bones renewed themselves. The atoms that made him yesterday were not the same atoms that made him years ago, and yet he still felt like himself. How could that be? If identity depended on material, then he should feel like a different person by now. But he did not. So maybe identity was not stored in matter. Maybe it lived in patterns. Patterns of memory, patterns of behavior, patterns of awareness, like a flame that keeps its shape while the fuel changes. The self might continue, even as its parts come and go. This idea was both strange and comforting. It meant he was not trapped by who he used to. The old mistakes did not define him forever. Past fears were not permanent structures. They were temporary states in a moving process. He thought about moments in his life when he had changed deeply. Times when his values shifted, when things that once mattered no longer did, when new interests appeared without warning. At the time, those changes felt dramatic, almost like becoming someone else. Now, they felt natural. Change was not the exception. It was the rule. If identity was a process, then growth was not something added on top of a fixed self. Growth was the self. This realization brought a quiet responsibility. If he was always becoming, then what he paid attention to mattered. What he repeated mattered. What he believed about himself mattered. The process responded to input, just like in physics, where systems evolve based on conditions. The self evolved based on experience and awareness. He noticed how quickly the mind tried to lock things into labels: good, bad, me, not me, success, failure. But reality was softer than that, more fluid. When he watched closely, even strong emotions rose and fell like waves. Anger appeared, peaked, and faded. Fear tightened the body, then slowly released. Nothing stayed forever. The idea of a fixed self began to feel less real than before, and strangely, that made life feel more open. If he was not a solid object, then he was not as fragile as he once thought. You could not break a process the same way you break a thing. It could bend, adjust, learn that. As the sun lowered and the park grew quiet, he felt a sense of space around his thoughts. He was still there, still aware, but less defined by any single moment. The question returned, but in a new form. Not who am I, but what am I becoming? And for the first time, that question did not feel heavy. It felt alive, as the man's view of identity shifted. A harder question appeared if he was not a fixed thing. If thoughts arose on their own, if the brain began actions before awareness noticed them, then what about choice? Did he really choose anything at all? The question followed him through ordinary moments, when he decided what to eat, when he answered a message, when he held back a word he almost said. Each time, the decision felt personal, immediate, real. Yet science told a quieter story beneath that feeling. He learned that many processes in the brain happen before conscious awareness. Signals move, patterns activate, the body prepares. Only afterward does the mind say, "I chose this." That idea was deeply unsettling. If choices were prepared before he felt them, then was free will an illusion? Was he just watching decisions happen for a moment? This thought made everything feel empty. If life was only cause and effect, then responsibility felt meaningless. Hope felt thin. But the story did not end there. Physics entered again, carrying uncertainty with it. At the quantum level, events are not fully determined. Outcomes exist as probabilities, not certainties. The future is not locked in advance. It is open within limits. This did not prove free will, but it changed the shape of the question. If reality itself is not fully fixed, then neither is the path of a human life. He began to see choice differently, not as total control over every event, but as influence, as participation. Like steering a boat on a moving river, you do not choose the current, you do not control the wind, but you still steer, you still respond, you still shape where you end. The self, as a process, did not need absolute freedom to matter. It only needed space to respond with awareness. That space was real. He noticed it in small moments, a pause before reacting, a breath taken instead of a harsh reply, attention placed on one thought instead of another. Those moments changed outcomes, not instantly, not magically, but over time. They shaped patterns, and patterns shaped identity. This reframed responsibility in a new way. He was not guilty for every thought that appeared. Thoughts arose on their own, but he was responsible for what he fed, what he repeated, what he acted on. Awareness did not control everything, but it guided the process. Just as observation in physics shaped outcomes, attention in the mind shaped behavior. This realization brought a quiet strength. Free will was not a switch you turned on or off. It was a relationship between limits and awareness, between chance and intention. He did not need to be the author of every thought to be part of the story. He only needed to notice. Now that night, he sat again in silence. Thoughts came and went as usual, but now he saw a choice not in their appearance, but in his relationship to them. He could follow them or let them pass. That small difference felt powerful. The question that once felt frightening now felt honest. If you are not fully in control, what do you do with the control you have? The answer did not arrive as words. It arrived as a sense of presence, a quiet knowing that participation mattered, and that awareness itself might be the most meaningful choice of all.